Stop him. He doesn't belong on this plane. The words crashed through gate C-18 so sharply that conversations froze. Rolling suitcases slowed, and every curious face turned toward a man standing quietly beneath the departure screen. Malcolm Hayes didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or wave the boarding pass resting calmly between his fingers. He simply looked at the gate agent with the steady expression of someone who had learned long ago that panic never changes the truth. The afternoon sun poured through the massive airport windows, painting long streaks of light across polished floors while boarding for Flight 417 to Seattle continued around him as if nothing unusual should be happening. Families gathered backpacks, business travelers checked emails, and vacationers balanced oversized coffee cups. Yet an invisible line had suddenly formed around Malcolm. He wore faded blue jeans, a plain black t-shirt, white sneakers, and a charcoal backpack that looked older than some of the passengers waiting nearby. Nothing about him matched the expensive image people expected from first-class travelers. And for Emily Brooks, the senior gate supervisor, that was apparently enough. She folded her arms and spoke with the certainty of someone convinced appearances never lied. "Sir, this boarding group isn't yours." Malcolm held out his pass without a word. She barely glanced at it before pushing it back toward him. "You need to step aside and let actual priority passengers board." A few people exchanged uncomfortable looks while others quietly nodded as though her confidence automatically meant she was right. One man in a tailored gray suit smirked and whispered to his wife, "Guess somebody wandered into the wrong line." A college student lowered her headphones and stared, unsure why a calm traveler was suddenly the center of attention. Near the scanner, Olivia Grant, a new employee only 3 weeks into her job, looked from Malcolm to the screen in front of Emily. Something felt off, but experience had already taught her that questioning a supervisor could end a career before it truly started. Malcolm remained perfectly still. His silence somehow filled more space than shouting ever could. The gate speakers announced final boarding updates while the jet bridge door remained open, waiting. Emily reached for the scanner again and shook her head. "I'm not delaying this flight because someone refuses to follow instructions." The sentence floated through the terminal like a judgment already decided. Malcolm glanced toward the aircraft parked outside, sunlight reflecting across the silver fuselage, and a nearly invisible smile crossed his face before disappearing again. Around him, strangers had already created a story from a pair of jeans and a quiet man holding a valid boarding pass. None of them noticed that the passenger list behind the counter was refreshing in real time, and none of them realized that within minutes a single familiar name glowing across that screen would transform a routine departure gate into the last place anyone wanted to stand while the truth quietly walked aboard. The silence around gate C-18 stretched until it felt heavier than the rolling suitcases crossing polished tile. Malcolm Hayes slipped his boarding pass back into his hand and took exactly one step to the side, not because he accepted Emily Brooks's judgment, but because he refused to let someone else's assumptions dictate his composure. His eyes wandered toward the aircraft waiting beyond the glass, its blue and silver tail standing against a bright afternoon sky, while baggage crews moved with practiced precision beneath the wings. He had watched airplanes his entire life. At 12 years old, he stood behind a chain-link fence outside a regional airport in Georgia, counting departures and promising himself that one day he would build something that connected people instead of dividing them. 29 years later, that promise had quietly become reality. Yet standing inside one of the busiest terminals in America, dressed in a $10 black t-shirt and comfortable jeans, he looked no different from hundreds of travelers passing through security every hour. That was exactly how he preferred it. No designer watch reflected the sunlight. No luxury luggage announced wealth. No assistants surrounded him with schedules and phones. Malcolm believed respect should arrive before recognition, and every ordinary trip became an unplanned test of that belief. Emily watched him from behind the counter with growing confidence, convinced that calm meant surrender. Sarah Collins scanned another first-class passenger without hesitation, smiling warmly and wishing the couple a pleasant flight. The contrast did not escape Olivia Grant, whose fingers hovered over the keyboard as she quietly studied the reservation monitor. Something about the name Malcolm Hayes tugged at her memory from orientation week, where executives had appeared briefly on presentation slides before disappearing behind charts and corporate goals. She frowned, trying to remember whether she had seen that same name connected to something much larger than a boarding group. Behind Malcolm, conversations slowly returned. A businessman muttered that airport staff always knew best. A grandmother carrying a stuffed teddy bear for her grandson shook her head and whispered that the gentleman had not caused a single problem. A teenage boy looked at Malcolm and then at his own father, silently learning how quickly strangers could create stories about people they had never met. Malcolm noticed every expression without reacting to any of them. He simply rested one hand on his backpack strap and checked the departure clock mounted above the gate. 11 minutes remained until scheduled pushback. Somewhere beyond the terminal walls, hundreds of computers synchronized passenger information every few seconds, updating names, statuses, and priorities without emotion or prejudice. Systems dealt only in facts. People often chose something else. Olivia finally clicked open a restricted information tab before immediately stopping herself, uncertain whether curiosity alone justified another look. The screen flickered for an instant as fresh operational data flowed into the gate system, and although she did not yet understand why, a quiet feeling settled over her that this ordinary boarding process was about to become the story every employee in the terminal would remember for years. Emily Brooks tapped the counter with polished fingernails, each quiet click echoing across the waiting area like a countdown only she seemed to hear. The boarding line continued to move around Malcolm Hayes, flowing past him like a river splitting around a stone that refused to drift away. He remained exactly where he stood, relaxed, patient, his eyes following a little girl wearing oversized headphones as she waved excitedly toward the airplane outside the window. The simple smile on his face somehow irritated Emily even more. She stepped forward and forced another professional smile that never reached her eyes. "Sir, if you are not boarding with your assigned group, you need to wait farther back." Malcolm looked at the digital display above the scanner and answered in an even voice. "I believe I am exactly where I need to be." The sentence carried no challenge, yet the atmosphere inside gate C-18 tightened immediately. Sarah Collins glanced between them before lowering her voice. "Emily, maybe we should scan the pass one more time." Emily shook her head without looking. "I know what priority travelers look like." The words escaped so naturally that several nearby passengers heard every syllable. A middle-aged man holding a leather briefcase nodded as though the statement made perfect sense. Another traveler quietly looked down at his shoes, unwilling to become part of the moment. Olivia Grant felt her stomach sink. She stared at Malcolm, then at the reservation monitor glowing in front of her. Training manuals had repeated the same principle again and again. Verify first. Assume nothing. Treat every passenger with dignity. Yet the scene unfolding before her seemed to follow a completely different policy, one built from impressions instead of facts. Malcolm adjusted the strap on his charcoal backpack and took a slow breath. 20 years of boardrooms, negotiations, delayed flights, and impossible decisions had taught him that character revealed itself most clearly during ordinary moments. The airport around him continued its familiar rhythm. Coffee machines hissed from a nearby cafe. Rolling luggage clicked across tile. A boarding announcement for another flight floated through the terminal ceiling. Life moved forward while judgment stood perfectly still. Emily folded her arms again. "If you continue holding up this process, I will have to ask airport operations to assist." Malcolm nodded once as if she had simply mentioned the weather. "You should always follow the procedure you believe is correct." His calm reply confused more people than anger ever could. Olivia finally reached toward the keyboard and quietly opened another operational window reserved for internal updates. A loading circle appeared for 1 second before fresh information streamed onto the screen. Her eyes widened. She blinked once, then twice, convinced she had read it incorrectly. The name Malcolm Hayes appeared beside a flashing executive status indicator she had never seen activated in real time. Before she could speak, the gate computer emitted a soft notification tone, and every employee behind the counter instinctively turned toward the monitor, unaware that the next few seconds would quietly erase every assumption that had filled the terminal only moments before. Olivia Grant leaned closer to the monitor until the reflection of the terminal lights blurred across the screen, and for a moment she wondered whether exhaustion had distorted what she was seeing. But the letters remained perfectly clear, bright against the blue operational window that only authorized employees could access. "Malcolm Hayes." Executive status active. Ownership priority clearance. Internal notification pending. Her heartbeat quickened as memories from orientation returned in scattered fragments. A presentation slide displayed for less than 30 seconds. A photograph of company leadership. A reminder that some executives preferred anonymous travel to experience the airline exactly as customers did. She looked up at the quiet man in the black shirt and then back at the screen, realizing the person standing alone near the scanner matched the face she had almost forgotten. Across the counter, Emily Brooks never noticed Olivia's expression because she was still watching Malcolm with complete certainty. Sarah Collins shifted uneasily and whispered, "Maybe we should verify the record before we continue." Emily answered without lowering her voice, "There is nothing to verify. If he belonged here, I would know." Several passengers heard every word. A woman carrying a travel pillow glanced toward Malcolm with sympathy, while a young consultant adjusted his expensive jacket and quietly stepped farther away, unwilling to be associated with someone already judged by the gate supervisor. Malcolm noticed every movement but remained composed, his posture relaxed, his attention drifting toward the aircraft outside where sunlight reflected across polished metal like calm water before sunset. The terminal felt strangely divided, one side operating on assumptions and the other still waiting for facts. Olivia finally gathered enough courage to speak. "Emily, I think there is an executive designation attached to this reservation." Emily barely turned her head. "You are new here, Olivia. Trust experience." The words landed softly but carried enough weight to silence the younger employee. Still, Olivia could not ignore the flashing indicator that had now changed from blue to gold. Another quiet notification appeared beneath Malcolm's name. Executive Manifest Synchronization Complete. Passenger Verification Locked. Automatic Leadership Alert Enabled. She had never seen those messages before. Sarah saw the color change on the monitor and took one cautious step closer. "What does that mean?" Olivia swallowed before answering. "I do not know everything, but I know this is not a standard reservation." Behind them, the boarding scanner emitted another gentle tone, almost like the terminal itself was patiently waiting for someone to pay attention. Malcolm folded his boarding pass once and slipped it carefully into his hand, showing neither frustration nor satisfaction, only the confidence of someone who understood that truth never needed to hurry. The conversations around Gate C-18 gradually faded as more travelers sensed something unusual unfolding, and without anyone realizing it, the center of power had already begun to shift away from loud opinions and toward a single name glowing quietly on a passenger list that was preparing to change every assumption made inside the terminal. The quiet notification on Olivia Grant's monitor disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived, replaced by a secure status banner that could not be edited or dismissed by anyone working at the gate. Her hands froze above the keyboard while the realization settled into her mind with surprising clarity. She remembered the final slide from orientation, the one the instructor barely mentioned because it almost never mattered. Executive leadership occasionally traveled without advance publicity to observe real customer experiences. Employees were told to follow policy, verify information, and treat every traveler with the same respect because nobody knew who might be standing in front of them. Olivia slowly looked toward Malcolm Hayes and understood that the lesson had just become real. Emily Brooks noticed her hesitation and sighed impatiently. "We have a schedule to keep. Close whatever screen you opened." Olivia answered carefully. "The system is asking for executive verification." Emily reached toward the monitor but stopped when she saw the gold security border surrounding Malcolm's reservation. For the first time since boarding began, certainty disappeared from her face. Sarah Collins leaned closer and whispered, "I have never seen that before." Around them, the passengers sensed the shift without understanding the reason. The businessman who had quietly judged Malcolm lowered his eyes and pretended to read messages on his phone. The grandmother holding the stuffed teddy bear smiled gently at Malcolm as if trying to apologize without saying a word. The teenage boy continued watching every detail, absorbing a lesson that would stay with him far longer than the flight itself. Malcolm remained perfectly composed. He glanced through the enormous windows where a baggage cart rolled beneath the wing of the waiting aircraft, and the reflection carried him briefly into an old memory. 20 years earlier, he had stood in another airport wearing a borrowed suit for his first executive interview. A stranger had mistaken him for airport maintenance and handed him directions to a supply room without ever asking who he was. Malcolm had smiled, then just as he smiled now, choosing purpose over pride, promising himself that if success ever arrived it would never change the way he treated ordinary people. That promise had guided every decision he made, every employee he hired, and every route his airline expanded across the country. Olivia gathered enough courage to speak again. "Emily, I think we should let the system finish its verification." Emily folded her arms, but did not answer immediately. Another soft tone echoed from the computer, followed by a new line of text that spread across the screen in bright gold letters. Executive manifest confirmed. Leadership travel protocol activated. Notify operations immediately. Sarah took one slow breath. Olivia stared silently. Even the travelers nearest the counter sensed that something invisible had just changed. Malcolm simply adjusted the strap of his backpack and waited with the calm confidence of someone who understood that facts never needed to compete with assumptions because eventually they always arrived first. No one behind the counter touched the keyboard after the final notification appeared because the glowing gold banner seemed to carry its own authority, brighter than every boarding light surrounding it. Executive manifest confirmed remained fixed across the monitor, while a small status icon rotated beside a single instruction that nobody at Gate C18 had ever seen activated during a normal shift. Emily Brooks stared at the screen as though it might correct itself, but the message refused to disappear. Sarah Collins slowly exhaled and whispered, "We should call operations now." Emily hesitated for the first time that afternoon. Confidence, once filling every word she spoke, quietly slipped away and left only uncertainty standing in its place. Olivia Grant reached for the internal phone with careful hands, following the procedure exactly as it had been written in training. Across the waiting area, the ordinary sounds of travel continued. Rolling luggage crossed polished floors. A toddler laughed at a toy airplane. Coffee cups rested beside laptop bags. Yet inside the small space surrounding the gate, time seemed to move differently. Malcolm Hayes remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, relaxed, patient, one hand resting on the strap of his charcoal backpack. He looked toward the aircraft outside and watched the sunlight stretch across the wing, calm enough that anyone walking by might have mistaken him for a traveler simply enjoying the view. The businessman who had quietly judged him earlier now glanced repeatedly toward the counter, noticing the change in every employee's expression. The grandmother smiled again, this time with quiet confidence, while the teenage boy watched Olivia make the phone call and realized that facts were finally replacing assumptions. A calm voice answered from operations. Olivia read the reservation number, then the passenger name. There was a brief silence before the response arrived. "Do not alter the manifest. Do not delay verification. Leadership travel protocol is active. A senior operations manager is already on the way." Olivia thanked the caller and slowly lowered the receiver. Sarah looked at her with wide eyes. Emily remained silent, unable to reconcile the ordinary traveler standing a few feet away with the extraordinary instructions now appearing across every connected system. Malcolm noticed none of the panic because he was not looking at the counter. Instead, he watched an airport employee help an elderly couple find the correct boarding lane, and a small smile appeared as simple kindness unfolded without hesitation or judgment. It reminded him why anonymous travel mattered in the first place. Policies could be written in conference rooms, but character revealed itself in terminals, gates, and everyday choices. Another notification quietly appeared beneath his reservation. Senior operations arrival estimated 2 minutes. Automatic passenger list lock enabled. Olivia read the line twice before looking back toward Malcolm. The same quiet man everyone had doubted had never demanded respect, never raised his voice, and never announced his position. He had simply waited while the system caught up with the truth, and now every second brought the terminal closer to a moment when one familiar name on a passenger list would speak louder than every opinion that had filled Gate C18 only minutes before. The sound of polished shoes approaching the gate was almost impossible to notice, yet every employee behind the counter instinctively looked toward the terminal corridor as a man in a Navy operations jacket walked directly toward them without checking a single departure screen. His identification badge carried a silver stripe reserved for executive leadership support. And the moment he reached the counter, his attention went not to Emily Brooks or Sarah Collins, but to the passenger manifest glowing across Olivia Grant's monitor. He studied the screen for less than 3 seconds before offering a calm nod that carried more authority than any raised voice. "The verification is correct," he said quietly. "Please maintain the executive travel protocol." Emily felt the color leave her face. "There has to be some mistake," she answered, forcing a smile that sounded less certain than before. The operations manager looked at her and then at Malcolm Hayes, who still stood peacefully near the boarding lane watching sunlight reflect across the aircraft windows. "There is no mistake." The terminal suddenly felt smaller, as though every conversation had stepped backward to make room for the truth. Sarah lowered her eyes. Olivia released a slow breath she had been holding for several minutes. The businessman with the leather briefcase remembered his own confident assumptions and quietly stepped away from the front of the line. Even the teenage boy seemed to understand that something important was happening without fully knowing why. The operations manager walked toward Malcolm and greeted him with genuine respect. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hayes. Thank you for traveling with us today." Malcolm returned a warm smile and shook his head gently. "Good afternoon. It looks like everyone has been having a busy day." There was no anger in his voice, no attempt to embarrass anyone, only the same calm presence that had never changed from the moment he arrived at gate C-18. The manager nodded once before turning back toward the counter. "Leadership travel protocol requires uninterrupted boarding and passenger dignity throughout the process." Silence answered him. Emily stared at Malcolm as memory finally connected with reality. She had seen his photograph before, not on a magazine cover or television interview, but during annual company training, where executives encouraged employees to treat every customer as if they mattered because every customer did. Malcolm glanced toward Olivia and noticed the young employee standing quietly beside the monitor. "You chose to verify instead of assume," he said with an easy smile. Olivia looked surprised. "I only followed the policy." Malcolm nodded. "That is exactly how good policies become good cultures." The operations manager reached for the boarding scanner and activated priority boarding with a single touch. Malcolm accepted his boarding pass and looked once across the waiting area filled with travelers who only minutes earlier had formed opinions based on ordinary clothes and quiet confidence. Then he spoke a single sentence that settled over the terminal more deeply than any announcement from the loudspeakers. "You never questioned a boarding pass. You questioned whether someone who looked like me belonged behind it." No one answered because no explanation could change what had already happened, and in the reflection of the giant airport windows, every assumption seemed much smaller than the simple truth displayed beside one name on a passenger list. The gate remained completely still for several seconds after Malcolm Hayes stepped forward because silence had accomplished what raised voices never could. Every traveler standing nearby watched the same ordinary man with the same black shirt, the same faded jeans, and the same charcoal backpack. Yet somehow everything about him now appeared different. Nothing had changed except knowledge. The operations manager scanned Malcolm's boarding pass, and the familiar sound of approval echoed softly through the terminal like a quiet verdict based entirely on facts. The display immediately shifted to executive boarding complete, while a second notification appeared on the internal system requesting a standard service review for the entire interaction. Emily Brooks noticed it at the exact moment Sarah Collins quietly lowered her eyes. Nobody had shouted. Nobody had argued. The system simply recorded what had happened exactly as it occurred. Olivia Grant stood beside the monitor, realizing that fairness was not complicated after all. It began with one decision to verify instead of assume. The businessman carrying the leather briefcase slowly approached Malcolm before boarding. "Sir, I owe you an apology," he admitted. "I formed an opinion before I knew anything about you." Malcolm smiled with genuine kindness. "We all make quick decisions. The important part is deciding to do better the next time." The grandmother carrying the stuffed teddy bear nodded warmly and whispered, "That is a lesson worth remembering." Even the teenage boy who had watched everything unfold looked toward his father and quietly said, "You always tell me not to judge people by what they wear." His father smiled with quiet embarrassment and answered, "And today I needed that reminder too." The operations manager completed several entries on a secure tablet before addressing the gate employees in a calm professional voice. Leadership reviews are not designed to punish mistakes. They exist to improve the experience for every traveler who walks through our terminals. Emily listened without interrupting. Her confidence had disappeared, replaced by reflection. Sarah glanced toward Olivia, silently grateful that someone had trusted the policy instead of appearances. Malcolm accepted his boarding pass and paused for one final moment before stepping onto the jet bridge. He looked back at the travelers still waiting in line and noticed faces that no longer carried certainty but curiosity, humility, and understanding. Airports connected cities separated by thousands of miles. Yet the greatest distance crossed that afternoon had nothing to do with geography. It was the distance between assumption and truth. As Malcolm walked toward the aircraft, the late afternoon sunlight filled the windows and stretched across the polished floor like a path waiting to be followed. Behind him, the gate slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. But something invisible had changed inside nearly everyone who witnessed the moment. A simple passenger list had corrected a misunderstanding. Yet the greater correction happened quietly inside the people who realized respect should never depend on clothing, titles, or expectations, because every journey begins the same way, with one human being standing in front of another, hoping to be seen for who they truly are. The aircraft door closed with a quiet click that almost nobody inside noticed. Yet the moment seemed to mark the end of something much larger than a boarding process. Malcolm Hayes settled into his seat beside the window and watched the terminal slowly drift farther away as the pushback vehicle guided the airplane from the gate. Below, hundreds of travelers continued moving through the airport carrying backpacks, briefcases, souvenirs, and dreams, each one hoping to reach a different destination, each one deserving exactly the same measure of dignity. At Gate C-18, the atmosphere remained unusually quiet long after the aircraft disappeared from view. Emily Brooks stood in front of the counter looking at the polished floor where Malcolm had patiently waited without anger, without demands, and without announcing his position. Sarah Collins reopened the service manual on the computer and carefully reread the first page that had always seemed too simple to deserve attention. Verify information. Respect every traveler. Never replace facts with assumptions. Olivia Grant quietly saved the completed service review before closing the system, but the lesson stayed open in her mind. She realized that leadership was not always found behind expensive suits or executive offices. Sometimes leadership looked like a man wearing faded jeans who remained kind while others doubted him. The businessman carrying the leather briefcase boarded with a different perspective than the one he brought into the terminal. The grandmother carrying the stuffed teddy bear smiled at strangers instead of looking away. The teenage boy walked beside his father asking thoughtful questions about fairness, and the answers became longer with every step. High above the clouds, Malcolm looked out across endless white sunlight stretching over the horizon and remembered the promise he made to himself as a child standing outside an airport fence. Build something that helps people feel welcome. Build something that connects instead of divides. Success had given him influence, but character had always been the destination. He opened a notebook and wrote a single sentence for the next leadership meeting. Respect is not an executive privilege. It is the first service every customer deserves. He closed the notebook and smiled quietly because the greatest change from that afternoon would never appear in a quarterly report or a financial statement. It would live inside one young employee who trusted policy over prejudice, inside one supervisor forced to confront hidden assumptions, inside one father who recognized his own mistake, and inside one teenager who learned that appearances reveal very little about the people standing beside us. Somewhere behind the aircraft, the passenger list would eventually be archived, another ordinary document stored inside an endless database. But everyone who witnessed those few unexpected minutes would remember something no computer could record. A name changed a conversation, the truth changed a room, and simple respect changed people. Malcolm closed his eyes as the airplane climbed into the bright American sky, knowing that the strongest kind of authority had never come from owning an airline, but from choosing grace when the world expected anger and choosing humanity before every title, every seat assignment, and every destination.